Thank you.
Thank
Does
you.
this work? Can you hear me? All right. So it's a real honor to be here with Karin, who's a genius, and who Association of Small Bombs blew me away, and I hope that it also leads some of you to family planning, which is also a brilliant work. And I thought that we could start out. You once generously reviewed my book as a nonfiction novel. And I really appreciate the compliment, but I think the harder thing to do is pull off what you've done in Association of Small Bombs, which is, it's a brilliant novel that among its many exceptional qualities is sentence by sentence as plausible as some of the most rigorous nonfiction. And I suppose you can't say that it's a novel written like nonfiction because no one would take that as a compliment. But to me, it's clear that you're possessed of a forensic eye, but also that you wear your powers of observation with a real lightness and discipline. So my first question is, how much do you care to tell us about where your knowledge came from? I mean, it's this knowledge, this intimate knowledge of the Delhi slums, of the Hubli forests, but also a deep knowledge of the bitterness that comes from professional failure. And the quicksilver changing nature of catastrophic grief. So where did you even get this wisdom?
Thank you for that introduction, Catherine. And before I answer, I wanted to say it's like a dream for me to be up here with Catherine Boo. I reviewed her book way back in 2012 when it came out, and I was looking at it the other day, and it really was a review with like not even a quibble. I really thought the book was fantastic. For those of you who haven't read it, of course, it's a really three-dimensional, in-depth look at the life of people living in this one slum across from Bombay's airport. And what she does so amazingly in that book is actually enter the perspectives of a range of characters. So there's kids who do trash sorting, there's rag pickers, there's a woman who is the power broker of the slum, there's her daughter who is studying Mrs. Dalloway and becoming a school teacher. And so you get a range of the different moralities in this one place, but also there's an unbelievable density of detail that every sentence seems to be laden with a phrase or an image that you have not quite witnessed or seen before, or you haven't cared to look at. So it was a real lesson for me, actually, as a writer, to read that book right around the time that I was working on my novel. And in general, I think Catherine's style of writing is a model of what engaged journalism can achieve. I think she's been compared to the famous 19th century muckraking writers, but a person, and I'd be curious to hear later if this is someone you actually like, but a person who I compare her to mentally is George Orwell, because there's a kind of omnivorous interest in the way different areas of a city work. The other reason I'm sort of thrilled to interview her today is that I was going through her past interviews, and I was reading one that was on this very beautiful looking website, and then I looked at the name of the interviewer, and it said Bill Gates. And I was like, wait, I was like, this can't be the same Bill Gates. And I went and looked it up, and it in fact was, the most famous man in industry on the planet, who had sat down and made the time to read Catherine's book and had actually interviewed her. So I have some big shoes to fill today. But so to quickly answer your question, my novel, The Association of Small Bombs, begins with a small bombing, which is a term that's used ironically in the novel, that happened in Lajpat Nagar market in Delhi in 1996. So it uses this real event as a starting point for a work of fiction. And in my case, that image of that bombing came to me not so long after 26/11 happened. And somehow it was a combination of it has a combination of a feeling of rage and also of shame that must have also had some counterpoint in my own personal life. And the image had been in cold storage in my head for many years. I hadn't really thought about this attack since the mid-90s, when I'd heard of it when I was growing up in Delhi. And so there's something, I think, mysterious about how a work of fiction starts, and then you kind of use that as a guide for the years that follow, that you trust your instinct. And in this case, yes, it's a novel that when I tried to distrust my instinct, I found that I couldn't go forward because the subject is so complex. So I actually had to report it at times like a work of nonfiction, which is why, as you were saying, there's the details often can give you the sense that you are reading a reported piece instead of a novel. So in your case, the question I had for you about details was one we were actually talking about before the panel started, which is that because there's such a density of detail in Catherine's work, I was wondering that when you actually sit down to write a page of a book like Behind the Beautiful Forevers, are you operating off memory at that point because you've looked at all your notes before, or are you sitting in a sort of painstaking way moving details from a page of notes onto a narrative?
Well, I use a lot of video in my work, and so... Okay. I use a lot of video tape and audio in my work, and so what I'll usually do before I write is I'll immerse myself thoroughly in the actual documentary evidence that I've accumulated, but then I'm going to put it away because you're writing from a position of having been deeply immersed in a situation or in a person's life for a long period of time, and by the time that you get ready to write it, you know pretty much where it begins and you know what's in it, and you write it beginning to end, and then you go back and you make sure that the way that you've written it is accurate. And part of what you do as well is you go back to the people that you're writing about. And you say, I said this, and this is the tape, and what do you think, and did I get this right, and what of this makes you stop and think, no, that's not quite right? So you're constantly working with the people that you're reporting on to get it as close to right as possible. But stepping back, one of the larger things, it's something that's really important to my work is understanding what Howard Becker calls the hierarchies of credibility, and that's people are really looking not to believe the experiences of the least powerful and the least affluent people in our society. First of all, they're looking not to engage in it, and second, they're looking for ways to discredit it. And that leaves the documentary journalist who writes about those communities with a tremendous level of responsibility. And I remember being an investigative reporter at the Washington Post earlier in my career, and I was writing about the deaths of people with intellectual disabilities, that people were used to, profoundly disabled people who lived in state care. And I'd identified hundreds of people who had died wrongfully. And I put those stories in the newspaper, and one of the things that I was aware about is if I got one detail wrong, every single injustice that I'd managed to document about those individuals would be washed away. It would be worse than if I'd never wrote the story. And so the sense of the importance of getting the details right so that you can bring attention to the larger injustice is something that is, I would say, it's harrowing. It's a harrowing part of my life because you know how easily it is that those credibilities of hierarchy can be undermined. So I have a question for you. I think that we both, so people will say, oh, Catherine writes about poverty, Karen writes about terrorism. And I think that when you use those terms, they have a sort of white noise capacity to them, in which after you say them, people can't distinctly hear what's going on around them. Mm-hmm. So maybe when you say terrorism, maybe somebody has a particular distinct mental image. For instance, Muhammad Atta in the cockpit heading toward the looming towers in Manhattan. Or you say poverty and people have an idea like a slum dweller with a concave chest reaching out his hands, a pavement dweller. And so the single image is often becomes the sum total of what people think they can handle. So they know what they need to know and they sort of feel that they're at capacity for it. But what your work does is to try to replace that single image with incredibly complicated, sophisticated, moving images. And I use moving in both senses of the word. So you show the grain of it, and then you show how these, and then through it you show with, in terrorism, how this idea of terrorism as this ineffable evil thing is actually the sum of small acts and specific human choices that are not necessarily determined by circumstance, but they're touched by them in a way in which that notions of freedom are never notions of pure freedom or pure evil are compromised. And I want to know how you created. He has this amazing character, Shaki, who is a terrorist, and he's kind of like the avant-garde of the working class. He's tired of doing small bombs. He's tired of the lack of imagination that people have in blowing up other people and places as a statement. And he's also not particularly religious. And he's also senses himself as part of a corporation, a global terror Inc., in which people in South Indian forests are influenced in the way that of their way of being as terrorists by movies like Rambo. And I wonder how you came to this incredibly compelling, complicated, and to use the word you use over and over again, avuncular, very clever, sly word that is, individual who is a terrorist unlike any that we've read before.
I should say the Rambo. There's a reference in the book to a terrorist group that is training and modeling itself on Rambo the movie, and that's actually taken directly from a lot of the stuff I read about the LTTE, where they actually would watch Rambo to get an idea of how to perform. So you have all these incredible details, obviously, that come out when you start looking for them. In my case, I think it's kind of what you said at the beginning, that terrorism is a word that's been glamorized in a negative way, obviously, but it's filled up our consciousness in a way that we can't see it. And my task with this book was to sort of reveal the actual banality of the pieces that go into terrorism, that if you're a terrorist, you're not always setting off, you're not always causing 9/11 or 26/11. There are these other attacks that happen for which the planning might be kind of shoddy, the group itself might be ramshackle, the ideology might be suspect, the materials that they're shopping for to put together the bombs might not come together in the way they want. So there's all these steps that these characters have to go through that reveal them to be actually petty and human, but that doesn't say that they aren't bad. I think that's the crucial other distinction, is that there's a way in which you can write about these subjects where you start letting characters off the hook. So I figured that if I just had a terrorist, for example, be a technician, that doesn't necessarily say much about his morality, but it does show you the process and kind of puts you in his headspace as he's going through these daily actions. So that I think that was kind of like a breakthrough I had in writing the book. And I didn't necessarily want to get too much into government policy or into higher level stuff, because that's the stuff of the news. The question I had for you, which is related to the one you asked me, is that in your case, the way in which Behind the Beautiful Forevers differs, I think, from your nonfiction pieces for The New Yorker, is that, so Catherine had a very long career writing for The New Yorker and The Washington Post. Those pieces are also about poverty, in a sense, about the mechanics of poverty, the institutions that are trying to get people out of poverty and failing sometimes. But what you don't do in those pieces is you don't get inside people's heads in the same way that you do in your Bombay book. And so I was curious about how you came to this particular tone. It's not so much even a question of how you got into their heads, but more of there's a kind of novelistic warmth. I think that's why people have called it novelistic, because you can sense the narrator has an unbiased affection for a lot of the characters, which in a piece for The New Yorker, you're not necessarily allowed. And I'm wondering if that was a struggle to arrive at that tone, or that was always waiting in the wings and was something you'd been wanting to do.
Well, I think that each project that you do has its own rhythm and its own ideology, but one of the things that was in my mind when I wrote Behind Beautiful Feathers was, well, I should say that I reported for 3 intense years, and the reporting made me on some level very sad. Sometimes when people say that my work is like a novel, I want to say, yeah, except for when the children die. Those are real children who died. When the police covered it up, those are real, so the injustices that part of what gives you writer's block as a reporter is a sense that nobody's going to care. Like it's turned your world upside down, and how are you going to make people care about these ordinary people and their profound griefs? And something that came to mind when I was suffering from my inability to write in a way in which people might engage in the death of a 15-year-old boy who lives on the pavement, is I thought of something that John Berger said, which is that you can experiment with your form while also addressing problems that are urgent in this world. And I thought that one way to do that would be to immerse you from the beginning so fully in the lives of the characters and the individuals and their complexities that, and to just start in the middle of things and hope that the reader would catch up, so that you wouldn't have an opportunity to put the book aside. When I finished my book, and my editor had asked me for some changes on it, and she was asking because she thought, well, if you made it more, more reader accessible, that people would read it. And my agent said, look, don't change it. Nobody's going to read this book. Just do it the way you want to do it. But my hope was that, because even though I knew that people didn't want necessarily to read a book about ordinary families in a slum that they never heard of, if you grip them with the emotional intensity, that they might keep turning the pages.
Before you ask me a question, I have a follow-up. I got you. Which is that in an interview, you said, when I first started going to India, I'd be at these dinner tables where people claiming a posture of great authority talked about what was going on in these historically poor communities. In fact, I was familiar with these arguments from my experience of writing about the poor in the US. Most of the people who do the talking about what it's like for the very poor don't spend much time with them. And the question I had about that was that, since you've had a long career now of doing this, of going into impoverished communities and writing about them, have you had to evolve a way of looking at the so-called poor? Like, do you feel like it's, when you started doing it, were you approaching them in one way and then you realized you were making an error of perception and you corrected, or has it been pretty much the same? But it seems like you would need some kind of deeper philosophy to actually sustain this kind of interest over time.
Well, I think one thing that I believe, there's the Italian philosopher and concentration. Oh, sorry. The Italian political philosopher and also concentration camp inmate Gramsci had this class of people he called organic intellectuals. And one of the things that Gramsci felt is that the poor were excluded from this class of organic intellectuals, that they lacked the capacity to have important ideas that were worth listening to. And one of the things that I've come to feel very strongly about in the course of my work is the importance of ideas and indeed philosophy in poor communities, and not just your usual religious philosophy, but intense, earned philosophy that helps people stay alive. And so when I go into a community, whether it is the community that I'm working in now, which is a very very poor and violent community in the United States, or whether it's a slum, or whether it's the swamps of Louisiana, I'm attuned not just to the conditions of people's lives, not just to the not just to interrogating the social mechanisms that allow them to get out of poverty, but also to the quality of ideas that they use to get through their days. There's this incredibly moving moment toward the end of your novel, and I'm not going to get the line exactly, but where you talk about a person in great stress and hardship looking at another person and feeling so moved by how did you survive what you've been through. And that's and people, that's not an empty question. People have an answer for that in many cases, and my job is to be patient enough to record that answer. And so the idea that I think there's a lot of people feel that there's no philosophy before bread. And that idea, I think, responsibility for that misperception falls squarely on the journalist, the people who are in those communities and don't invest the necessary time it takes to get deeper inside the ideas that keep people alive. So I have a question for you. I mean, one of the many things that you play comically, but it actually is serious, is the illusion of state protection. In the idea that terrorism is something that the state can protect you from, just like the gates that we go through to go to this Litfest that may or not be working. And that that like many of the big ideas in your book, you create it indelibly with the ambulances that don't come after the bombing, but yet you return to it over and over again. And I wondered if you could speak to that as a theme in your work.
Yeah, some of it actually came out of just going to Lajpat Nagar market and talking to shopkeepers, and it had been many years. It had been more than 10 years since the bombing had happened. And first I was reminded of something that you had written about, which is that in India, I think, and this is true of other countries too, but specifically in India, once that people have been through a hardship, there's a belief you shouldn't actually talk about it. So a lot of shopkeepers were saying, why are you bringing this subject up? We've gotten over it. It was terrible. People died here, but we're not going to tell you things. But a few that I talked to and who did open up, their memories were not actually so much about the bombing, because in a sense the bombing happened in a second, and there was glass flying everywhere. A lot of the shops had mirrors on them, which was a strange fashion at the time. So that those actually were things people remembered, or that there was like people lying on the ground and so on. But they focused on the fact that first the fire station and the hospital were called many times. They actually didn't show up for a long time. That when the ambulances did come, people were just thrown into the back of the ambulance. That once the bombing had happened and a couple of days had passed, when the Municipal Corporation of Delhi came, they asked shopkeepers for estimates of their damages, and when the shopkeepers told them the figures, they said, "You're lying, your estimates are too high, bring them down." Interestingly, and this is the kind of thing that comes out when you really go deep into a moment in time, is that it was the period of the 13-day BJP government in 1996. So the BJP came into power pretty much just long enough for this bombing to happen, which was another way in which these people got orphaned, where the government that was in power when they were attacked went away, and now there was a less accountable government because it hadn't been there before. So these things came out early on, and then they kind of informed the fabric of the book. And to me, it was an interesting thing to write about as well, because obviously in the West and in America and Europe, terrorism gets an unbelievable amount of attention. Like it gets far more attention than it actually should. And that's one of those strange consequences of 9/11 is Donald Trump. Because America has not been able to get over this one attack that happened 15 years ago. And actually, instead of maybe doing something surgical in Afghanistan for a few days, ended up getting into a war in Afghanistan, getting into a war in Iraq, and affecting its economy in different ways, and then building up this culture of fear. So I thought, in those cases, when these attacks happen, the response is actually very good in the West, partly because of the media over-attention, that ambulances do come, firefighters do give their lives, all sorts of volunteer workers show up. But our response is often one of indifference, especially if a bombing is a so-called smaller bombing, which shows up in the news for a day or two and vanishes. So that was very much the engine of the book. And there was something, to me, very devastating and moving about characters who were part of an international phenomenon, that they saw themselves as being connected to these other terrorist attacks, but were actually not getting the same kind of care and comfort from the state that the victims of a larger attack would get. And of course, in India, even the victims of a larger attack don't necessarily get compensation and so on. So that kind of was where that came from. My next question for you is whether. So you say this thing towards the end of Behind the Beautiful Forevers, which is something of a thesis statement, I think, where you say that you're interested in why it is that when we live in such unequal societies, why they don't implode. And the book is kind of an argument saying that it's partly because the poor, because the particular structure of these slums are locked into a battle with each other for resources. And as a result, the sort of upper layer of society can go on the way it wants to. Do you think, though, that especially with the rise of the sort of governments we're seeing around the world, is that going to change? Do you think in a place like India that's going to always be the case, or do you feel like there's structural reasons why inequality will eventually lead to kind of mass violence or mass revolution, or it'll remain the way it is?
I mean, what's really striking is that if you think about the 1950s, the gross inequalities, the poor didn't have access to what the rich had. Today, with televisions, with mass media, low-income people have an incredible nuanced sense of what the wealthiest people possess. But what's really striking to me all over the world is the ways in which people in these oppressed conditions don't look at, say, their Donald Trumps, who have made their fortunes by stiffing their workers and stealing the aspirations of their students at their ineffective university. They blame the people one level up. When there's this moment in your book where somebody has been imprisoned, Malik, in a Nepali jail, and he talks about facetiously about the brotherhood amongst the dispossessed. And when you have Afshin, right, is a woman who believes that her son has been killed in the bombing attack in the market, and she despises the family of another who have actually lost their only two sons, and her hatred is vicious until the moment in which, so there's no solidarity. The hatred is vicious until the moment in which she realizes her son is safe, and then in an instant, her hatred turns to compassion. And I think that's a very true and troubling aspect of this world. I see it in every country that I've ever been, and how easily people turn against each other for decisions made in fancy offices and boardrooms a world away. The decisions made by the truly powerful, the interlocking directorates, of the powerful, create the conditions in which the poorest citizens blame each other for what it is that they lack.
But you don't think there's a breakdown, that you think that has remained sort of the same over the years, so that will, like, this question of like whether if inequality keeps growing in a place like India, whether that will become untrue at a certain point, or you think that it's impossible to say?
Well, I'm lousy at Vedic predictions, so I mean,
Yeah.
your word as
Okay.
good as
No.
mine. But I think that we keep being warned. We keep being warned that the center is not going to hold, and it keeps holding.
Yeah.
And in most, but not all communities. And I think that is because the anger is not directed at, at the oligarchies. It's directed at other people who are struggling.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
One of the things that you do really beautifully in your book is to capture the profound psychological toll of inequality. Your wonderful character, Vikas, a documentary filmmaker who's not been successful, looking across the street at the straight lines of the house being erected by, continually being erected and approved by a tech czar, as you call him, a man in designer slippers. But you have a tremendous sensitivity to the bitterness that can be created when people's dreams start to fail, and not just in the lower classes, but in the middle classes, amongst the children and the people who have descended from a really distinct line of freedom fighters. This sense that people have that they were built for more and they're not getting it. Can you tell me why? You also make connections between inequality and global terrorism that I think are fascinating. Mm-hmm. And between the demolition of slums in Delhi, the beautification of Delhi, and the crisis in Kashmir. Mm-hmm. I think that your sense of the butterfly effect there is really profound. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. I was writing this book really wrote it from like 2009 to 2014. And I was writing it, I was partly living in New York at the time, and then I moved to Bangalore for a couple of years, and then I went back to the US. And it was a time of disappointment both in the US and here. In terms of, there was a depression, obviously, of a sort that was happening, the recession that was happening in America, and here too, growth was slowing. So there was this sense I had where all the characters in my novel, whether it's a documentary filmmaker, whether it's a small-time terrorist, where they're all feeling this lack of funding, that the terrorist is complaining, oh, I'm not getting the funds to make the bomb that I want to make. And the documentary filmmaker is feeling like, oh, he's not just missed out on this golden period of globalization where people were getting much richer very quickly in India, but also now in general, he's stuck in a career where he'll never get out of it. And there's all these scenes where he's dreaming of becoming a chartered accountant again. He used to be a chartered accountant before he became a documentary filmmaker. And I wanted to write a scene like that because in a strange way it's comical to have I don't think there's ever been I thought there might probably never been a novel where a character dreams of becoming a chartered accountant. And the other connection that I made, which kind of powered the novel, and which connects to your work and I want to hear about, is that the novel begins with Vikas and his wife Deepa, they're sort of middle-class Delhi Punjabis, losing both their kids in this bombing in Lajpat Nagar. And they've sent the kids there to pick up an old TV that they keep having to give to the electrician. And their first reaction actually is shame, where they're afraid to say to their rich friends why the kids had been sent to Lajpat Nagar, why they were there alone. And to me, when I started writing the novel, actually, Vikas was not a documentary filmmaker yet. But then I changed him because it was interesting to me that you can have a character like Vikas, who in my novel actually does work not that dissimilar from Catherine's, where he's making much worse versions of what you're doing. But he's making documentaries about footpath dwellers and about Arthur Road Jail and about Tihar Jail. So he has a deep interest in the poor, a deep compassion for the poor. But as a middle-class bourgeois man himself, he feels shame that he's not making as much money as his relatives who are in IT or who are in family businesses and so on. So I wanted to exploit that very strange paradox that just because you have compassion for the poor doesn't mean you're free from the neuroses of of money yourself. I just kept going with that, and I felt there was something honest about it too, because I think as artists, we tend not to talk about the way money affects us as well, and affects what we choose to do, and our self-esteem. Like, I think that there's lots of structural reasons why artists are doing a lot worse in places like, especially in the US right now, people are getting paid a lot less, even at newspapers and magazines, than they used to. So I wonder if you're in your work, when you've spent so much time studying low-income communities, whether that's affected your own sense of class as a person, and what form that might have taken.
Well, I think that if you're reporting really hard on worlds in which people are struggling to get by, it becomes very difficult to move amongst people who have a great deal, because the cognitive dissonance is too great. I'm seeing in the audience the only person I really could meet during the course of my reporting, which was Naresh Fernandez at Scroll. I could meet with somebody who might share my concerns, but I found it just intolerable to be, so you end up being very isolated in the course of your work, because otherwise you have all this psychological traffic that doesn't actually get you closer to the documentary reality that you're trying to describe. And at the same time, then, when you finish a project, you know how much it takes out of you psychologically, so that there's always, you always sort of have to, it takes a little while for me to move into the next project. I'm not a junkie on, on these projects. I don't sort of get off at it. I get very disturbed and distressed by it. And I need to, to sort of get my own, feet on the ground in a good way before I can go out and do it again, I would say.
Yeah, and a question that's connected to that is, when you finish a project, let's say you've worked on, how many years did you work on Behind the Beautiful Forevers? Was it?
3 years of hard reporting, and then a year of writing, and then it came out.
So after you've spent 4 years reporting, let's say, on one slum, do you feel like you actually, and I mean this from an artistic perspective, not a moral one, but do you feel like you've exhausted your interest in a subject? Do you sometimes feel like, oh, I don't want to know anything more about this place because I've literally learned everything I can? Or do you have a feeling that you have to keep coming back to it now that you've made a kind of moral investment in it?
Well, so I'm constantly going back to the place that I was writing about, because we put some money in the book back into that community. Chinmay Borkar and I think he's here. And when I'm there, I can't stop reporting. I mean, I'm still like, it's all I can do not to be sticking the microphone and the videotape in people's face again, to get the story of the new NGO that's the new injustice. It's so I don't think that you ever come to the end of a project and say, I've got this, because the minute you've got it, it changes again, and that's, part of one way that I identified with Vikas, the documentarian, is he goes, after he's lost his sons, he starts just hanging out in markets, almost waiting for the bomb to go off. And I think I'm very much a practitioner of what you might call present tense reporting, in which you don't go into a community after the tsunami, after the Ebola. You go into a community and you get to know people, and you wait to see what happens in their lives, whether the events are small and large, because they think that that's the way you really understand what's happened. I have a strong suspicion from the course of my work and the validity of a lot of oral history. The way that you understand what has happened in a community is not to start after it's already happened. It's to be part of the community when it happens. And you're never going to get to a place of perfect understanding of any community. But you're trying through work that is immersive in interviewing, but also using investigative techniques, including in India, the the Right to Information Act, the amazing, powerful, underused Right to Information Act, to bring the reader closer than he might otherwise have gotten to. But at the time, like right now in my project, my new project, I'm sitting there going, what is this, where is the telling event that will allow me to explore, some of the, I'm always looking not just to tell stories, but to examine the structure of a society. I feel like if I'm only telling stories, I'm really just trafficking poverty porn. So the question is, when you're in a community, what event is going to allow you not just to tell the story of an individual, but to tell a story of say, a crisis in, say, the public hospitals or the fast-track courts that is affecting, thousands, tens of thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands of more individuals beyond the individuals that you're speaking with. Which is, part of the thing that I think we're both doing is trying to find the balance between these small stories. I mean, if you think, most of what history is constituted by are stories of people that never get recorded. I mean, what do we even know about our history if we don't understand what's happening to ordinary people? But how do you find the balance between getting close to those ordinary people and also shining a light on these great inequities that exist in this? One of the things I really admired in your book is the way you have sort of flitting through the novel the idea that there are that people who have been jailed as the perpetrators of the violence weren't guilty at all, and you have a passing sly line that talks about someone who's being held even though he was in jail since before it happened. But I really admired your restraint as a writer to leave that in the background and not put it front and center.
I think that was just this general decision I made in writing the book, where I was trying to write in a sense, with an audience in Delhi in mind. I mean, I'm writing in English, so there's always a complication. And I thought that in Delhi, we know that this kind of thing just happens. That yes, the police often arrest innocent people. That in the case of this particular attack that happened in '96, where 13 people were killed, 30 were injured. It was a Kashmiri group that got disbanded very soon after they had done it. But when the investigations were done, they were done without independent witnesses present. When people were arrested, certain of the people they claimed had done it, were in jail before the attack. And you're right that it could have actually been a book about how that stuff is crazy and terribly unjust. But I somehow operated from this position where I thought my audience dislikes and distrusts the government as much as I do, and that I didn't need to explain that further. And so in a sense, I let that be, and I became more interested in, once you know this about your world, how is it that you operate on a daily basis? Like if you're a victim and you know for a fact that the wrong people have been jailed, how are you going to actually find any kind of catharsis? Like, where do you go for it? And so, you have Vikas who actually starts going to markets, ostensibly to film markets, but actually on some subconscious level, he's waiting for another bombing to happen so he can suffer the way his children have suffered. Or you have a terrorist who's guilty because his best friend is the person who was arrested, not him. And those became more interesting individual psychological reasons to write, kind of the way you were saying, like, and I suppose this panel is technically about little people, which is not a term that I think either of us like.
No,
but in the sense that, if it's about individuals who are not who are not covered by history, by capital H history.
Well, I wonder, it's about 15 minutes. Should we open it up to, does anybody have any questions? Your first row, you go first.
Yeah, no, I think he said.
First of all, I would like to say that Behind the Beautiful Forevers is the first book I read without a break, without a pause. I just went for it. My first question to Catherine Wu is, at first, what made you decide on this particular area called Annawadi? Because there are many such areas in Mumbai. And second question, when you met these people for the first time, Was there any doubt in their minds? Like there were doubts. When did they become friendly with you? Can you just elaborate on that?
Yeah, okay. So the first question, I should just say, by way of background, that I had been working in some of the poorest communities in the United States for 15 years when I met Sunil Kilnani, my husband, in 2001. And so I would be going from my work, say, in an Oklahoma City housing project to mainly Mumbai, where, because of my interest, I'd be spending time in slums, and I would be trying to understand this phenomena. You had the greatest amount of social spending in Indian history at the same time as you had, through grassroots activism, this tool of public accountability, the RTI, that made possible some, a level of forensic reporting that was never before possible in India, and I kept waiting for somebody to do it because it seemed so obvious to me, and eventually I thought, if nobody's doing it, then I will try. Very much in a sense of, of whatever I do, it might be stupid, but it's going to be better than nothing. It's a crucial thing to really examine what's going on in the lives of historically poor communities during this tremendous moment of change, and that it was sort of a dereliction of the social contract implied by journalism, that nobody would be looking hard at that. And so I thought, well, let me at least try. And so when I did start to try in 2007, I was working in 6, perhaps 7 low-income communities, including one in Turbi Store, in Vakola. I was working all over the city. And what I kept returning to Anawadi because of the hope there, because it was really distinctive. From other community, it was ringed by, it was by the airport, it was ringed by 5 luxury hotels, the airport, there was advertising agencies were opening up right behind on the pipeline, and people had a real sense that it was possible. It wasn't that they thought that it was possible to break the barrier really between the poor world and the rich world, but they felt that they had a chance to get into, closer to the middle class, closer to stability. And I think as a journalist in poor communities, you're not looking to write a book about, like, look at people just sitting there languishing. You're trying to examine, what are the social springboards that allow people to get out of poverty, because that's the question that the people in those communities are asking themselves. And so it was an excellent place for me to examine the springboards of 21st century slum. And when I first meet people, the answer is simple. I say, I'm a reporter in poor communities. I do this weird thing, and I try to tell, look in detail at your lives so that I can tell other people. And one of the things that a lot of people don't think about when they're outside those poor communities, those people in those communities understand so well how they're diminished and degraded. They understand the stereotypes that other people hold about them. The girl who goes to college understands her friends won't come home. And so when you say, I think if people understood the complexity of your lives a little better, they might be less quick to judge you. People get that right away. And as a matter of ethical principle, the people that I write about have the opportunity to pull out of the project up until the very last moment that it's printed. The people who I name in the book, except for corrupt public officials, have decided it willingly, and I think that's only ethical.
Yeah, in the front.
I'm curious to know, Behind Beautiful Forever was done on National Theatre as a play. How was that experiment? All the unhappiness and the grief of some people being put into art. Did you watch that production, and what was your reaction? Were you involved in the production?
I was, and one of the first things that when the idea came to me, I thought, this is a terrible idea. But I thought, well, whatever the contract is, it should make sure that the people whose lives are being depicted have formally agreed to this. And so the playwright, the director, the set designer, some of the people who were in the play, they went to the community and interviewed the people. But what was really striking to me is how excited people were in the community to be in a theatrical production. And that's because, in a way, theater, street theater, theater on the Maidan had a much, they recognized that as a meaningful art form, much more than they did a book. What was the book to them? So not only were they involved, but the production would not have happened without their contractual sign-off and without them helping as advisors. And one of the interesting things is how closely, when they watched the production, they could recognize each other in it, and they found it to be way funnier, I think, than the audiences in the UK did. No, they watched it. They made a special video production that was shown in the community.
My name is Professor Sitesh Dutt. I'm a management professor. My observation is that it's becoming very hard for honest journalists to report, particularly on areas where it upsets the establishment, to the extent that people are wiped out, physically removed. This culture of violence is now very much prevalent, because it's easy to, in the US for instance, it's easy to, I've been to the US several times, it's very easy to get a gun. In fact, we have heard of children shooting, If the parents are upset with the child just shoots the parents. So in this culture of violence, so there is a grammar of violence which is going on around the world. I've been to the US, all over the world, and I'm asking each of you, whether in the US and in India, have you been threatened by what you are exposing? Because these are very influential persons whom you are talking about. If you report the truth. If you don't report the truth, there is no problem.
Short answer, yes. I've been threatened. I think that most journalists who are doing work that exposes corruption, uses real names, will at some point in their lives be threatened with violence. And one of the things, I don't talk about it a lot, because when people like me are threatened with violence or physically harmed, we have recourse, more recourse than the people who are routinely brutalized in their communities and have no recourse. Do you have a comment?
I think it's much easier for novelists, but it's interesting. I think what novelists end up doing is self-censorship. So when I finished my book, there's many political references in it to the Gujarat riots, to Modi, and so on. And I had this moment talking to my editor here where we were discussing whether these references should remain. And we realized that we were only talking about this because the Perumal Murugan thing had just happened, where he had been sort of censored in South India. And we immediately stopped doing it after that. We didn't discuss censoring anything, but it's interesting to me that it takes one or two incidents and writers will begin wondering whether they're going to be safe writing about certain subjects.
Hi, thanks. Very good evening. My name is Pranav. I'm a fourth-year law student. Catherine, in your book, you made this really nice, you say this really nice line. For the poor of a country where corruption thieved a great deal of opportunity, corruption was one of the genuine opportunities that remained. Now, I'd like to know can you tell us a little more about this line? I read Arvind Subramaniam's book review in the Business Standard, and he speaks about how both the market and state intervention is really not a solution, and he bases your book as his thesis. So can you tell us a little more about corruption, and can corruption actually be a leveler of sorts? Yeah, thanks.
Well, it is a leveler in low-income communities. I mean, following people in the community for 3 years, the single family that did really well in a time of immense wealth in the country were people who was somebody involved with Shiv Sena who exploited the opportunities of other poor people in order to get ahead. And that, in a nutshell, is why it's not sustainable as a means out of poverty. The ways in which, you look at I mean, one of the things that I constantly saw in communities is the difference between what was supposed to happen in a community, whether people were dying of TB as they were right and left, and what they were actually doing. At the health post near the slum, they were selling Amway instead of addressing deaths that were going down the slum lane. And that's why we can't romanticize or look a blind eye at corruption, because there is a toll, and the toll, it's not just about money. It's a life and death. When people are deprived of services because the government is not doing what it's supposed to be doing, instead engaging in circulating money amongst a political elite, that is a private catastrophe for many, many poor people, and it cannot be. So only the most cynical would see that corruption itself and its lifting effect in poor communities was a public good.
Thank you so much, ma'am. We have 3 minutes precisely, so one question. We can take
one short question.
Short question, yeah. That's more important.
So this is a bit of a long question, but I'll still try to make it really concise. Question for Catherine. How would you define truth in a piece of narrative nonfiction? Because, at a fundamental level, besides reporting, you're also trying to tell a story which often sort of collides with the chaos of real life, and for the same reason, a piece of narrative nonfiction is as much an act of inclusion as much as it's an act of exclusion, And I often feel like for someone who practices long-form journalism himself, that I feel that there are 3 versions of truth. Like there's a version of truth that's for the journalist. There's a character's version of the truth, and then there's the truth of the book or the piece. If you would like to
So nobody is writing their work, doing this reporting work on a perfect, this Archimedean ethical point. Every time I'm making the choice to be in this slum lane, I'm not being in this slum lane. But what I'm trying to do overall is to create a version of the story that the people involved would recognize as true. And I think if I recognize it's true and they recognize it's true, that's the best I can do. And one of the things that happens when you do this kind of nonfiction work is that other journalists come into the community and ask people questions. Essentially, they say, did it happen? Is it real? And the best review that I ever got was from a young woman, Manju Vagakar, who's the main character, and somebody, I don't know what it was, like for the Evening Standard, somebody came in and asked her, had she read it, and she said, what she wrote is what I am. And that's sort of what that's the best you can hope for, is that the people in the community don't feel betrayed by what you've done, but they feel like they've been engaged in this extremely difficult struggle to get it as close to the truth as they possibly can. Thank you.